On July 25th, as most of you will know, there was a presidential coup in Tunisia. It was a very popular coup at the time. And the popularity, combined with the fact that it was not your run-of-the-mill classic military coup, meant that most people didn't even want to call it a coup when it first happened. Now, the population was primed for this to happen because of all these years of dysfunction, having dysfunctional governments. Now, we also have to remember that a lot of the elected MPs in those dysfunctional governments, they weren't only working within a very difficult context, that was riven by polarization, et cetera. They also, a lot of them didn't have enough funding to have an office or to go visit their constituencies or to have research assistants. So, I don't want to be too hard on Tunisian parliamentarians for not delivering. The parliaments could look like a circus with people battling over pieces of paper. Famously last year, Abir Moussi, this woman from a pro-old regime party, a pro-Ben Ali party, famously, she came into parliament with a helmet, saying that there were security threats against her, et cetera. And all of this behavior made people think parliament was very circus-like. They also had a lot of difficult contextual factors to deal with, like not nearly enough funding, et cetera. But never mind the reasons. The governments were often dysfunctional and often weren't delivering for people. Combine that with the fact that the 2019 elections, Tunisia's third post-revolutionary elections, brought into power populists. The most important of which was the president himself, who is still president today, President Kais Saied. President Saied and some of the parties that won the most votes in 2019 presented a stark contrast from the presidents and parties that had come before. How? What was different about them? Well, Kais Saied had no political party, and he seemed to evince no desire to create one. He was a constitutional law professor who hadn't even chaired the chess club before he became president. He really never led or organized much of anything. He didn't really have much of a public activist life at all. He'd been very quiet. So a lot of people who were fed up with this endless merry-go-round of parties bickering and dysfunction in parliament looked at somebody like Kais Saied and looked at some of these newcomer parties, including a pro-Ben Ali party, as being outsiders. Outsiders whose hands did not get dirtied by this pacted transition I talked about that came about in 2015, 2016. The most famous culmination of that pacted transition, just to give you guys a mental image, was Ennahda's 10th Party Congress in 2016, May of 2016. I'll never forget being in the stadium at the time and watching none other than Beji Qaeda Sebsi, the president of and founder of Nida Tunis, the so-called secular party that had maligned Ennahda as a bunch of violent Islamist retrogrades who couldn't even read or write in the elections, had served under both the Bourguiba and Ben Ali regimes. He was their keynote speaker at Ennahda's 10th Party Congress. And when he strode onto that stage to talk, the entire stadium of Nahdawis, many of whom had experienced unspeakable abuses under the old Ben Ali regime, and who had been desperately afraid that Beji Qaeda Sebsi, that this man and his party would throw them back in prison when the elections happened, they erupted into cheers. Beji, Beji. It was amazing. It was unforgettable. They cheered louder for him than they did for their own party president, Rashid Ghannouchi. So when I say pacted transition, that's the sort of headliner moment that I'm thinking of. But as much of a feel-good moment as that was, it wasn't delivering for average people. It wasn't reforming the security sector. It wasn't creating a constitutional court, a Supreme Court to harmonize the old bad dictatorial legislation with Tunisia's new democratic, free and fair 2014 constitution. It wasn't delivering economically for people. So a lot of good it did your average person in the average Tunisian's view. These new actors in 2019, actors like Kais Saied, actors like some of these newer political parties, they weren't painted, they weren't maligned by participation in that pact. They looked like fresh outsiders. I often describe the parties to that pact as people riding a ship in extremely turbulent waters who have decided to handcuff themselves together so that when the ship starts to take on water, they all begin to drown underneath it. And the outsiders in 2019, they weren't handcuffed. So they inspired a lot of confidence. Kais Saied also milked it a lot, to help prime the population. He was an aesthetic constitutional law professor who got his coffee from the same shabby, average coffee place before and after he became president. Not a golden toilet seat kind of look. Kais Saied, instead of talking about draining the swamp, Kais Saied called his opponents viruses. And he called them microbes. And he called them demons and traitors. And he threw them all under the same bus together, presenting himself as the sole messianic savior in this terrible situation. And many people wanted to believe it. And we have to empathize with their pain. And there was a lot of pain. On Ennahda's side, we talked about the trauma and the propaganda and the vilification, but also for average Tunisians, there was a lot of pain economically, a lot of pain in terms of watching the police brutalize people in much the same way as they, for your average Tunisian who wasn't involved in political activism as they have before the revolution. So we have to understand that. People were primed and ready because they had very legitimate grievances. Combine that with COVID. COVID had hit Tunisia hard, especially last summer when the presidential coup happened. A lot of Tunisians had family members who were in hospital or who were gasping for air, needing ventilators that they couldn't get. They saw people in their government, like their prime minister, Hisham Mishishi, pictured at the swimming pool while all this was going on. This understandably made people angry. There was also a lot of classism in the way that the COVID lockdowns were implemented in Tunisia. A lot of Tunisians don't have access to internet. They can't go to school online. Very few people, compared to the EU or the United States, are part of the laptop class. There were curfews, very harsh curfews that prevented a lot of people from even making a living. And over half of slightly over half of the Tunisian economy is in the black market. It's an informal economy. So even if the government had been compensating people with checks, they wouldn't have gotten those checks to at least half of the population, the working population. I went back in January. I was there in July, August, interviewing people, went back in January, and almost everyone I spoke to who had vehemently argued that July 25th was not a coup in the summer, including some people who were more informed about the legality of matters, party heads, party activists, even in parties who had been very much with him on July 25th, had reversed course and actually started calling it very casually an inqilab in Arabic, a coup, when I went back in January. But, at the time that happened, it was quite popular for these reasons, but he closed parliament with military tanks. There were actually tanks in front of parliament. The democratically elected parliament, including parties that had cheered him on, disbanded it, wouldn't allow them to even go to their workplace. And immediately he instituted, informally, throughout any clear, crisp decrees, these vast travel bans on entire swaths of Tunisian society, like every single parliamentarian who had been elected in all three parliaments since 2011, including parliamentarians who supported him. They couldn't leave the country. A lot of business people, if your identity card said that you were a business person, you also couldn't leave the country. The media, unfortunately, is self-censoring a lot in Tunisia. There's a strong muscle memory in Tunisian media of the things one says and one does not say when there's a single man who holds all the power, as Kais Saied has, since he closed parliament and effectively ended Tunisia's constitutional rule on July 25th. Tunisia has been ruled by the decree of one man since July 25th, with no meaningful checks and balances, institutionally or in civil society, really, on his power. Like I said, the parliament's been shut. I'm just talking about democratic institutions in the post-2011 years that are being obliterated systematically. No more parliament since July 25th. No more constitutional rule since July 25th. Media, bumpy. A lot of it self-censoring. Other parts are still, doing the job that good journalists do, but it's an increasingly monovocal show in Tunisian media with a lot of parroting of what Kais Saied says. Tunisia's High Judicial Council, which was its last safeguard of judicial independence, remember they never got around to creating a constitutional court, so this was as close as they got. It was shut down by President Kais Saied's decree. He decreed this from the Ministry of Interior, ominous when one man with all the power is making decrees from the Ministry of Interior itself, the same gray slab of the building where people have been tortured that we were talking about. He decreed its closure last month in February. Look, the Anti-Corruption Commission that Tunisia's 2014 constitution had created was very early on after July 25th shut. All of its records were taken. We don't know where those records are right now, or how and indeed if corruption will ever be prosecuted to the sad degree, to the insufficient degree that it was prosecuted before July 25th. Easy, the elections board, that's been one of Tunisia's great triumphs since its 2011 revolution. Easy is the board that has overseen those 3 free and fair national elections and other local elections. It still exists. It's still got funding, but Kais Saied has not met with a single member of it since July 25th. So it's on the chopping block, as is Tunisian civil society writ large. Tunisia's seemingly vibrant civil society that has so often been applauded by outsiders is on the chopping block. Kais Saied has been toying around with a decree that would basically silence Tunisian civil society and tie its hands. We're still watching very closely what's going to happen with that. But there's a huge debate now inside Tunisian civil society about how to organize, how to oppose. There are systemic problems in Tunisia that relate to the economy, that relate to corruption, etc. And they don't have easy fixes. There are real complex reasons why none of the 10 governments so far after the revolution, it's 11 now, have been able to solve these problems. It's not easy. And Kais Saied certainly hasn't spent much breath on explaining how. Instead, he is repeating in much more dramatic form the same essential mistake that Tunisia's post-revolutionary governments made before him, which was to focus unilaterally on political problems and political solutions at the expense of Tunisia's socio-economic justice. And other big problems like security, sectoral reform. So his idea is that we need a new constitution. This 2014 constitution that was passed almost unanimously, that was so such a model democratic constitution in many ways, obviously not perfect, but in many ways, that this needs to be thrown out. It needs to be chucked in the bin, really. And we need a new one that has a stronger presidential system. He's really fetishized strong presidential systems. You could even see it in the way that he taught his constitutional law course. He thought that the American system was good because it was a strong presidential system. He often misinterpreted a lot of things about that system. And he didn't like to teach about parliamentary systems. So he has this whole idea. He has a hope for remaking Tunisia's political system that looks very esoteric. The closest thing we can really compare it to is Gaddafi's Jamahiriya system, where you have an almost hourglass shape of government. You have direct democracy, direct elections at the most local level, and then you have a strong president at top, but you have really nothing in between. And Kais Saied thinks that that's the better system because he thinks that everything that comes in between, like civil society, media organizations, political parties, Parliament, they're all corrupt. He doesn't like Parliament as an institution. It's not that he doesn't like the existing Parliament. He doesn't like Parliament as an institution. So as you can see, as you can predict, there are a lot more problems down the road for the most vulnerable Tunisians who have already been hurting the most.